Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Center for Research on Globalization at GlobalResearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour radio program. My name is Michael Welch, and we're talking about Syria and some of the dialogue around that country. Of course, on this program, I think, successfully debunked a lot of the narratives around that conflict. Now we want to try to get to the nub of exactly what this conflict is all about, and where it's going as we move forward. Joining us from Austin is founder and editor of 21st Century Wire. His name is Patrick Henningsen. And he's looked into this subject in quite a great deal of depth. In fact, he's been to Syria in the last year. So, Patrick, welcome to Global Research News Hour.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Okay, now, I think first off, let's go back about 7 years or 7.5 years. I know that we're on the 7th anniversary of the original incursion, and it seems to me that in the background, and this is something we don't hear very much about, that oil and energy politics play into the mix. As I understand it, the Syrian government had been brokering a pipeline of natural gas pipeline that seemed to cut around some of the Qatari and U.S. interests and Turkish interests. Do you want to maybe explain some of that background, because I think it's pretty important?
Yeah, sure. There are a number of competing pipeline projects in this region, and almost all of them are designed to deliver natural gas or oil to the Mediterranean, basically. So direct access to the European market, and then there's a whole number of gas plays right now, actually along the coast, starting with Cyprus. So you have contested gas reserves there between Turkey, Cyprus. This goes back a while territorially between these two countries as well. And then you have Lebanon and Israel are also in conflict over a part of their overlapping, what they see as their gas reserves offshore. All of these yet to be exploited and very expensive. In fact, will require foreign investment. For all these countries would require foreign investment to realize the potential of these gas plays. So in the meantime, some people would see a more practical route is coming from the Pars gas field, for instance. This is one of the world's largest natural gas reserves, which is shared between Iran and Qatar. And Qatar is a small but wealthy Gulf emirate, which is adjacent to Saudi Arabia, and then Iran definitely does not have the ability to develop that at the moment, partly because of sanctions and a lack of foreign investment. And there's a whole conversation about the U.S. running point on the containment of Iran's economy via sanctions and other methods, but of coercion internationally. Okay, so the other option is from Qatar through Syria through to Turkey, and I believe in the Turkish port town of Selin, you already have potential for shipping oil directly to tankers and getting product then to the European market in another way. The other competing one, of course, is the controversial one, which would really be from Iran through Iraq to Syria, through to Tartus or Latakia, which would be in access to the European market. So you can tell Turkey would definitely have a piece of the action with regards to Qatar. They're very close allies, so that's a natural partnership. Of course, the problem is what's in between Qatar and Turkey with regards to that. A lot of people don't realize that there is an oil pipeline which was operational before the creation of the state of Israel, which ran from Kirkuk or Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, from Kirkuk to Haifa. in Israel, and that was shipping oil up until about 1949, and the Iraqis discontinued the flow of oil because of the situation with Israel, which was a burgeoning situation at the time. And so that pipeline, and also because of a number of attacks by Palestinian rebels, and also in Jordan as well. So it was unstable. Here's the problem with all of the competing pipeline projects is to guarantee the safety and stability of that supply across that region right now at this point in time is not practical. And so I don't see the realization of any of these projects in the near future. Perhaps in the long term, maybe. And so this is where you have the practicality problem when you're looking at what's going on in Syria, for instance, and around it, and then you're looking at these competing pipeline projects and all the alliances that are attached to each competing project. And yes, there is a reflection between those interests, differences of what would be their favorite pipeline project, and then the sides that they're taking on the ground right now in Syria. So you can learn a little bit there, but in terms of practicality, very difficult. And I think even the major players would admit that.
Of course, there's also the long-standing enmity towards any Middle Eastern leader who's pursuing a kind of a pan-Arabic nationalism, which is pretty much close to what Mr. Bashar al-Assad represents. And so all the more reason to seek some sort of a regime change. But it does appear over the course of the last 7 years that a Libyan-style regime change, if that's in fact what was being attempted, has failed miserably, especially after the involvement of the Russians on the ground at the invitation of the Syrian government. So, are we pretty much at the point now where we can rule out that as a possibility?
I think in the Libyan style, yes. I don't think that could happen. I don't actually, now looking back at it, and also after having been to Syria myself with my colleague Vanessa Beeley, who has also been many times to Syria and reported on the ground there. But after seeing the way the country is laid out, the security situation, the overwhelming popularity that Bashar al-Assad has within his own country, and the lack of any viable opposition, and the sort of toxicity of the Islamist militant opposition, which are effectively terrorist groups or a conclave of various terrorist factions. So it's not viable, it's not practical. But I think what you had, and I'm going to make a pretty bold statement here, I think what you had with Syria is very similar. If you look at the plans to cripple the Russian economy by the West, in both cases, I believe the United States, the advisors who were advising President Obama, were looking in the case of Syria, we're looking at maybe a Syria pre-Russian alliance Syria, and so they didn't factor in Russia's entrance into the conflict. But even then, they underestimated the cohesiveness of the state, the nation's sovereign state of Syria, just as they underestimated the cohesiveness and diversity of the Russian economy when imposing sanctions on it. So in terms of economic performance, Russia has weathered that storm economically with the oil crash, with sanctions, and diplomatically, strategically, geopolitically projecting its influence and success in places like Syria. In Syria, however, has been able to withstand a tremendous amount of economic adversity. Okay, but Syria doesn't have nearly the resources and the control of its borders that a country like Russia would have to withstand full-on economic warfare. Syria has been choked off, has been suffocated economically because of a joint raft of sanctions, not just the U.S., but the EU as well. And you have to look at, if you go to the IMF reports and you go and look at the trade between Europe and Syria pre-2011, you can see the upward trend. So Syria was doing tremendous business. I know business people from Europe, there's fashion labels, in fact, that were in the process of setting up white labeling agreements with Syrian textile manufacturers in places like Aleppo, with a massive industrial sector. In fact, the biggest industrial sector in the Middle East, full stop. Okay, that was completely destroyed and dismantled and taken to Turkey. And I can say that I saw the remnants of that firsthand when I was in Aleppo. Okay, and this is one of the big untold stories of this war, was the destruction and robbing of the industrial sector of effectively the Middle East industrial powerhouse, which was around Aleppo. And so you have textiles, you have agriculture, pharmaceutical, engineering, printing, lots of countless amount of businesses and heavy machinery and manufacturing in that part. So that's one part, the economic warfare, dismantling their industrial sector, sanctions, and this is encouraged black market activity. A lot of black market goods coming from Lebanon, so it's increased price inflation. Plus, they had to devalue their currency in order to survive, and so a free fall in the value of the Syrian pound, and so real wages have not recovered. So you're talking about people whose paycheck is only worth 1/10, in some cases 1/50th of what it was before the troubles started. Okay, the other thing is Syria is not a major oil producer, but Syria produced enough oil to export and do something like 10 billion a year in sales. Uh, Correct me if I have the figure slightly off, but around that in terms of annual sales with the European Union. And the biggest buyers of Syrian oil were Italy, Germany, and a few other clients. Okay, so the oil production in Syria, and then that funded the government basically. Those oil exports funded the government. They're a large percentage of government for the government to meet its balance of payments. Russia is similar as well. The government state-run functions and stuff rely on oil revenue, and also the tax as well on the oil. And it allows them to subsidize the price of fuel at home. Okay, so this was a good system up until 2011. And so what they had is not only that, you have the occupation of Syria's oil fields, the theft of Syrian oil first by ISIS, and then ISIS effectively handed it over to the Kurdish SDF forces, which are backed by the United States. So there's very few countries that could withstand hyperinflation, a loss of their energy sector, a loss of their industrial sector, hyperinflation, black markets, sanctions that won't allow basic medical equipment in. So you have a case that I saw firsthand in Aleppo, where you had terrorist-held area in East Aleppo. The hospitals had enough drugs and pharmaceuticals from all sorts of sources, mostly European, from Germany, from NGOs like the Syrian American Medical Society, from Médecins Sans Frontières. We saw packages of their supplies in the terrorist-held East Aleppo M10 hospital, for instance. Literally drugs falling out onto the street after the fighting finished, and we were able to go in and do a survey of some of these areas. Okay, and then meanwhile, across town in West Aleppo, government-held West Aleppo, they don't have antibiotics, they don't have syringes, they don't have the basic medical supplies, and so people are dying or for instance, wounded people with staph infections and having to amputate limbs rather than.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I was just wondering because I mean you're speaking to the economic warfare aspect of it. The crippling of the economy is offsetting any actual regime change dreams. But I'm also wondering if you could address the issue of the balkanization of the country. I mean, that's something that comes up, especially you brought up the Kurds just now, and talking about how it could certainly serve certain that can serve a certain agenda. I'm reflecting on what the Turkish incursion into Afrin, which was in response to attempts to arm the Kurds in that border area, create a kind of a border security force there. Is that an aspect, that balkanization project, is that a plan B that we should be looking at seriously?
Yes, exactly. So right now you have a situation where the United States has gradually embedded itself in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, with its Kurdish partners, which are essentially Kurdish YPG, People's Protection Units, some of them rebranded as the Syrian Democratic Forces. This was a stunt pulled by the United States in 2016. And so you have this contested area along the northern border of Syria, which is Turkey's southern border. Okay, so but here's the problem. Okay, it would appear that the U.S. and the Turkish interests diverge in the sense that the United States are partnering and arming Kurdish militias, and so these are apparently the sworn enemies of Turkey and Ankara. And this is a new Islamist Turkish state, by the way, that effectively, for all intents and purposes, suspended its constitution last year and gave the President Erdogan unprecedented powers. So this is a transition from the Kemalist secular democracy to something very close to a totalitarian system with a very heavy religious accent on it. So you look at this northern border stretching from northeastern Syria across to Afrin and then Idlib, and then you have close to the Latakia, which is government-held areas in the far west of Syria. Okay, so what's important here is that the Kurds of Afrin and the Kurds in further in Qamishli and Kurds in Manbij and Kurds in the further reaches of northeastern Syria. This is east of the Euphrates River. This is not a monolithic Kurdish group. Just as the Kurds in Iraq are not monolithic politically, there are fundamentally competing philosophies of government, of organization. And so in Syria, you have the YPD, and so the the PYD. So the PYD is basically an offshoot, philosophically, of the PKK. And so the Kurdish Workers' Party, based in Syria, this is the same Abdullah Öcalan, I believe his name is. He's the one of the original founding fathers, let's say, of the PKK, this Kurdish workers movement, which is mainly based in eastern Turkey. And this is what the government in Ankara has the big problem with traditionally. And so, but although the Syrian Kurds have the PYD, that socialist brand of Kurdish communist, you would say, have a lot of similarities with their brethren in Iraq and even in Turkey. They're not the same. And if you look at PYD statements, traditionally they're not in favor of an ethno-nationalist state. What they are in favor of is to have Kurdish autonomy within a Syrian federalized system, and it's very local government centric. So it's very much it's a grassroots philosophy of governing, and even in Iraq you have two competing, the Barzani tribal model of government versus this advanced libertarian. It's a quasi-libertarian socialist, a collectivist model of government, which you see in this other side. So who is Turkey going to ally with? Turkey will ally with more Islamist Kurds. And so, and probably this is who the United States will have the most success with as well, in Syria. And so this is why Turkey will tolerate the SDF and U.S. alliance to a degree. But like say the Afrin Kurds are more sympathetic, have been anyway, towards Russia, for instance. They've been working side by side with Russia. They have a better relationship with Damascus. And so the United States is not able to dominate Afrin. Turkey wants to encircle Afrin right now. It's sending its shock troops doing the forward operations, which are basically the same Islamist and terrorist organizations that occupied East Aleppo and some of these areas before East Aleppo was liberated. I'm talking about the Free Syrian Army, which is ostensibly a terrorist group. Ask any Syrian, and they will tell you they're guilty of some of the worst atrocities in this conflict. Nour al-Din al-Zinki, this is the group that beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian boy, Abdullah Isa. They're part of Erdogan's shock troop coalition. They're sending in, and then the Kurdish forces will be coming from behind. They've deployed Turkish forces. Turkish special forces as well. And so they want to sort of besiege the remnant YPG Kurdish militias there holding up in Afrin. The idea is to join Jarbulus, which is a border town further east, which is totally Turkish occupied. They're using Turkish lira as commerce, Turkish telecoms. Turkey's running electrical power lines, underground power cables to give power to that city. They've effectively taken over the Syrian city, which they originally invaded in August 2016 in Operation Euphrates Shield. And so this is what's going on in Afrin is Operation Euphrates Shield 2.0. But it's not clear if it's going to be successful because although Turkey generally likes to maybe invade and conquer things that aren't going to put up too much resistance. Hence, that's why it's sending jihadi groups in to do the sort of the heavy lifting, and not Turkey itself, because sustaining heavy casualties for this president is still a tenuous situation in domestically, politically. But at the same time, he wants to project an Islamist, neo-Ottoman sort of all-conquering kind of a holy war, which I think the word in Turkey it's Gaza, Gaza, which is a holy war or a crusade. And so he's the yeah.
I just wanted to. I mean, with the dynamics you're talking about. I mean, if even there is a desire to balkanize Syria and undermine, and I mean, you see a lot of characters in play. I mean, Israel is involved as well, bombing out with their strikes outside of Damascus, and that. I mean, whatever the official line might be, it does seem like that's designed to put a further strain on the Syrian Arab army. So even if this is what the desire is, there's no guarantee that a balkanized Syria, if realized, is going to be beneficial to any of these players. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I don't see, even if Turkey was able to occupy, which it wants to join Jarbulus, to Manbij, to Azaz, to Afrin, to Idlib, which is one of the remaining holdouts for Al Qaeda in the Idlib province. So it wants to control that line and to possibly absorb part of northern Syria into some kind of a Turkish-controlled area. And Erdogan has also stated publicly in the past that he wants Aleppo, that Aleppo belongs to Turkey. So there's that, but will they be able to actually administer and hold on to that? What are the odds of this? It's not clear. But but if you look past that, the impracticalities of Turkey controlling these areas, just like the impracticalities of the United States controlling Raqqa and this creating a new Erbil around Raqqa or around Manbij, and then or creating a Kurdish autonomous state. It's not practical. But when you look at what is practical, Turkey and the United States share one common interest, which is to weaken and fracture the government in Damascus and the country of Syria. So on that point, they're both absolutely working towards the same end. And if you look at their strategy, anytime you see things going in the direction and in favor of Damascus, you'll see fighting break out and operations breaking out that would possibly pull resources of the Syrian Arab army. So the idea is to overstretch the Syrian Arab army and wear them down in a war of attrition. This is what Turkey and the United States, I believe personally, that they're doing behind the scenes. That this spat they have is strictly superficial and academic in other sense of the word. But it's to overwhelm, and also Israel is backing. Clearly, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Israel is also backing multiple rebel factions, especially the ones down in Quneitra and along the occupied Golan line in southern Syria. So that, again, is stretching the Syrian army's resources. So if you look at a situation like Ghouta, the reason they haven't been able to resolve this in so many years, not only because they're avoiding mass civilian casualties and trying to find a way to do this successfully, but also because they simply don't have the ground resources. They're stretched on 8 different fronts. Imagine fighting a war on 8 different fronts. How successful can any country or any army be? It's quite a miracle, in fact, that Syria has been as successful as they have, partly because of the help of their allies. But so I think that is part of the strategy. Then to peel off this piece of Syrian Kurdistan as semi-autonomous, semi-republic, a state that's not a state but a state within a state that the U.S. is occupying. And the big thing you need to pay attention to is nobody has fired a shot at the United States, who have multiple bases now set up in northeastern Syria. No one has fired a shot really and taken on Turkey. Both of those two countries are NATO countries. So under Article 5, if anyone was to hit any of them, their allies would be obliged to act on their behalf. And then you have potentially a bigger conflict and a bigger war. But if you look at it geopolitically in terms of not allowing Syria to control its own borders, and right now the only borders Syria really has control of are its border with Lebanon. Okay, but the really important areas it doesn't have full control of. It could if they are able to be successful in East Ghouta and successful in some of these other areas. They then will have the resources to deploy to secure their borders along Iraq, along parts of northern Syria. In fact, if the Syrian army moved into northern Syria, the Kurdish forces there couldn't do anything, and the U.S. might be forced to leave as well because it's not practical at that point. They're only doing, the U.S. and Turkey are only doing what they do because Syria does not have the resources on the ground to administer and protect all of its border regions from Jordan to Israel to Turkey and to Iraq. It does not have the resources to do that. And ISIS is still being allowed to fester by the United States in pockets. The U.S. has admitted this. You even look at statements by General Mattis a couple of weeks ago. We have them. We know where they are, but we're not going to engage them at the moment. They're letting ISIS basically be there in waiting as a territorial rooster, agent provocateur, to be unleashed at any time. If the U.S. weren't there, ISIS would be out of the country within weeks, totally eradicated. But because the U.S. are there, so the U.S. can't be in Syria unless ISIS is in Syria. It's a simple equation.
Well, I know we were both kind of at the end of our time now, but I want to thank you very much, Patrick, for breaking these very complex dynamics down for us. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
And of course, we've been joined by Patrick Henningsen. He is the founder and editor of 21st Century Wire, a frequent geopolitical analyst. He joined us from Austin, Texas.